So my name is Mia, and I work with Haley here at CMI. And in case you don't know about CMI, CMI is a non-profit organization whose main office is here in Revelstoke. And most of our time is spent facilitating professional development opportunities, such as courses and conferences, for people working in the field of ecology. But the CRED Talks is kind of a special project, and it is to help us share knowledge about the ecology of the Columbia Mountains region. And it is a speaker series focused mainly on science communication. It is here to help people like you learn more about the ecological research and related projects taking place in our area. And topics vary and include themes such as land management, citizen science, and research techniques, among other things. This series is supported by the Columbia Trust, so a big thanks to them. We'll be recording this talk, which is what this thing is. So you can access it on our website next week if all goes well, because we've been having some issues. But the CRED Talks after today will be taking a little bit of a break, but it will start up again in the new year. And the next talk is scheduled for January the 16th at 12:15. And it will be given by Karen Bray, a fisheries biologist with BC Hydro, and she will be talking about kokanee living in our reservoirs. But now I would like to introduce you to Meghan Anderson. And Meghan is a wildlife biologist working with Wildlife Infometrics Incorporated. She works on caribou and moose research and management projects from her office here in Revelstoke. And she completed her Master's of Science in the Revelstoke Lake area, where she spent her day bushwhacking and collecting moose poop, which sounds fun. So, welcome.
Hi, my name is Meghan Anderson, and I work in Revelstoke as a wildlife biologist. I'm going to talk today about ungulate populations and how they're managed. And it's meant to be more of a discussion than an actual talk. This isn't necessarily something that I did as a work project, but it's more just of interest discussion. So first I'll talk about caribou populations, and we'll review recent caribou population trends. Next I'll move to moose populations and their trends. And then we'll look at whether or not we can manage both populations to be stable and increasing. And we'll finish with some current population management activities that are being done in the BC and the Kootenay region. So you may have heard in the media about the caribou populations. Those have been going on for a while. And most recently, moose population declines across BC as well. There's been quite a lot of pressure on the government to do something about those moose population declines from First Nations and Hunters Group, because moose are a favorite species to hunt. If you are a good critical thinker and a biologist like myself, though, you will be asking yourself, well, okay, media says that there's a decline, but all this fake news, show me the actual data. Are these declines actually happening? So I will be focusing on moose and caribou populations in the Kootenay region. That's just because I needed to choose an area to focus on, and this talk was supposed to be about something local. So the black outline you see here on the screen, that's the Kootenay wildlife region. It's a jurisdictional boundary, and it's not an ecological boundary. So that is why the caribou populations are cut up and cut by this jurisdictional boundary. So for example, you see that the Columbia North population is cut by the Kootenay boundary. That doesn't mean that when I show you population data, it's just for the portion that falls in the black area. It means I've just chosen to include Columbia North and not groundhog in the population data that I will be showing. And that's also why the Subselkirk's population is cut in half there. It doesn't mean that population just ends at the border. It just means that as far as BC is concerned, it only wants to manage the Canadian portion, while those animals still do cross the border. The data, these blobs that you see here are based on telemetry data, so it's based on about 90 or 95% of the data, which is why you see some disjointed blobs. It doesn't mean that there's just a little caribou hanging out by itself. in that cusp blob, that tiny blob down there. It just means that the way that these population boundaries were calculated, it ended up with tiny little blobs like that. All right, so let's have a look at some caribou population estimates. As you can see here, there's a few that have clear population declines. The top one here, Revelstoke Lake, is a sum of population estimates from the Columbia North, Columbia South, Kinbasket, and the Frisbee or Quest populations pulled together. Also, you can see that the Columbia North and Columbia South populations appear to be declining. Other populations are clearly under 100 individuals, which is also concerning, but there's also some populations where we just don't have a whole lot of estimates. Maybe there's only 3 or 4 estimates, and there's also huge gaps between years. This is normal for ungulate population estimates. In fact, this is actually quite a good amount of data compared to other regions. So that's why, as biologists, we tend to rely on other data, other metrics of population trends to get an estimate of the actual population trend instead of just actual population estimates. There's quite likely more recent population estimates available for the Kootenay caribou populations. I just have on display here publicly available data. So another metric of population trends that we can look at are caribou minimum counts. Minimum counts are what biologists use when they can't get a population estimate, because population estimates are difficult and expensive to obtain. So minimum counts are when populations are being surveyed, you count a certain number of individuals and you know that there must be that many individuals in a population, and you're not accounting for the number of individuals that you may have not seen. So they're quite useful for giving an overall trend. You need quite a few numbers, though, to be over the years to be able to get a decent idea of what the trend is. We can see here it paints a pretty bad picture for caribou in the region. All appear to be declining or already at quite low numbers as well. Another measure of population trends that we can look at are recruitment numbers and population growth. So recruitment is the number of calves that will survive until March of the next year. So calves are born in the spring, and if they survive until the next March, we consider them to have probably survived and be recruited into the population. So if 15% or more of those individuals survive, the population is considered growing. If it's less than 15%, that population is likely declining because there are just not enough individuals, new individuals in the population to account for caribou that are dying or leaving the population. So in red here I have years and populations where that number was less than 15, and you can see for most cases it is. Population growth is calculated with lambda, which is based on calf recruitment and female survival. If it is 1, the population is considered stable. If it's less than 1, it's considered declining, and if it's more than 1, it's considered growing. And again, you can see here, for most cases, for caribou, it is less than 1, with the exception of a few earlier measures for Columbia South and Columbia North. Again, likely to be more recent estimates for these populations. I just have on display publicly available data. So next we're going to move on to moose populations. Moose populations, unlike caribou populations, are surveyed within management units, and that's because moose don't form discrete herds like caribou do, and they're measured, their populations are measured in these management units instead, which is what you see here. This is just up for a reference because that's where I will be reporting on the moose population numbers. So south of us is the 4WA region, and we are the 4WB region. To the east, we have the 4EC region, and in the south central Kootenay region, we have the 4EB region, and east of there, in the southeast, is the 4EA region. So here are moose population best estimates for the Kootenay region. These are a combination of actual survey-based data and guesstimates. So because data wasn't available in all these years, provincial biologists made an estimate as to what they thought the population might be, and that's what you're seeing here. So it's summed up in each game management zone. The population was summed up from the management units, and that's what you're seeing displayed. So the declines were concentrated mostly in the eastern portion of the region, with the exception being that the population in southeast Kootenay appears to be recovering lately, and the population south of here in the southwest Kootenay seems to have recently started declining. So we'll look at moose population declines, recruitment data as well. And here I have recruitment based on calves per 100 cows, which is just another way of displaying calf recruitment. So it's just the number of calves per 100 female cow moose in the population. And this number needs to be 25 or greater for the population to be growing, and less than 25, the population is considered declining. So you can see the calves per 100 cows in both the northwest and southwest region, Kootenay region, appear fairly good, but when we just look at the portion of calves per the population, there's some concerning numbers. I just have the most recent estimates displayed here. To get an actual idea of the trend, you'd want to look at several years of data, but that would have been too much data to display. And again here, we see that there are some numbers that indicate something to be concerned about, and you may want to investigate those numbers more if you were a biologist. But it's a mix. There's both increasing population years and years where their populations were declining, probably because of low recruitment. So we've shown that for sure caribou are declining and moose are declining. It's also worth noting that until the 1940s, caribou populations were considered rare or absent in the Kootenay region, with the exception of the moose populations on the western slopes of the Rocky Mountains. So now that we know that both caribou and moose populations are declining, can we do something to save both those populations? In a sense, can we have our cake and eat it too? Well, it's not quite that simple because moose and caribou are competing against each other in an indirect sense. So due to habitat disturbance, in our case in the Kootenay region from cut blocks, it tends to create more moose forage and deer forage. And that tends to result in more moose and deer in general. And when there are more moose and deer, that tends to mean that there are more wolves, so more predator populations. The roads that are associated with those cut blocks tend to also make it easier for wolves to travel through the habitat and access caribou habitat and then kill them. So wolves will travel up to 4 times faster on a linear feature than through the forest. These increased populations and ease of movement mean that there tends to be more predation on caribou, and those caribou populations are declining. So in general, until recently at least, moose populations were increasing and caribou populations were declining. However, now we're seeing that moose populations are declining in certain areas and caribou populations are declining as well. So you might be asking yourself, why did I come to this talk? She's so depressing. It seems like there's nothing we can do about this. So I thought I'd put in a cute photo interlude. And here's a cute photo of a pika bringing you some flowers as a consolation. So what are we doing for caribou at the moment? Well, we're doing quite a bit. The provincial government has set aside 2.2 million hectares of mountain caribou habitat to be protected for them. What does that mean? Well, it's 95% of their highly suitable winter habitat, or 56% of their entire mountain caribou range. There's also recreation closures, so that's why you cannot mountain bike on Frisbee until July, and that's why there's also snowmobile closures on Keystone. That's a total of 1.5 million hectares that's been closed to recreation seasonally. Also, regionally, within the Kootenay region, within our region, we've done alternate prey management. So the hunting permits here in Revelstoke region or the Revelstoke Lake region were increased, which resulted in moose densities decreasing from 1.5 individuals per square kilometer to less than 0.3 individuals per square kilometer in 2014. That was done to return moose to a more ecological or historical population. So I mentioned that increase with forestry, and that's what we saw here regionally within the Revelstoke Lake District. That moose populations had increased about fourfold with the advent of large-scale forest harvesting, and that correspondingly caribou populations were declining. And in order to manage that, they decided to increase the number of hunting permits to bring moose populations back to a historical abundance. As the moose population declined within the Revelstoke Lake region, wolf populations dropped regionally from 25 in 2007 to less than 10 individuals in 2009. The Columbia North caribou population appears to have stabilized, but the two other smaller herds in the region have continued to decline, and that's likely just because those populations were already too small. In some regions, predator control has been used, so that means killing wolves. That tends to have increased calf survival, and some populations have also stabilized. Also regionally, we've used maturity pens, and there's another maturity pen up near Chetwynd. The Chetwynd maturity pen is called the Clean Ziza maturity pen. That one has seen good success, and the local caribou population increased from 32 individuals to 61. That maturity pen is considered to have been successful because it also used predator control. Whereas the one here called the Revelstoke Caribou Rearing in the Wild project only saw calf survival increased, but so far the population hasn't increased as much as the Clean Ziza one. And the reason for that difference is considered to be the predator control. Other regions have used supplemental feeding. That has not been done in the Kootenay region. It has increased body weight, but there has been no increase in calf survival. This isn't really surprising because for years caribou biologists have been arguing that the reason for the declines has not been a lack of food for caribou. Is translocations. So in 2012, 19 northern mountain ecotypes were released in the South Purcells. So caribou are divided into ecotypes based on their behavior and region, and northern ecotypes tend not to migrate in terms of elevation up and down the mountain seasonally, whereas the South Purcell herds do. So they have two different behavioral strategies, and that translocation increased the population from 15 individuals to 20. But a lot of those individuals that were translocated were lost. And overall, the experiment is considered to have been a failure, as most translocations are. What are we doing for moose? Well, we're still at the start of things, considering that moose populations are relatively recent compared to the caribou population declines. So the province started a study called the Moose Limiting Factors Study to examine what may be causing the moose population declines and then figure out from there what to do about this moose population declines. There's also been several examples of government, First Nations, and industry collaboration to come up with new management initiatives to manage moose populations. Some of the things that government could do to manage moose populations, if they wanted to, are hunting restrictions, access management, so that means closing roads or shutting down roads, which tends to be associated with increases in moose populations because it restricts access to hunters. Also predator control, again, killing wolves, and habitat management. So changing regulations to forestry, requiring certain things of forest industry, using prescribed burns to increase the amount of moose forage, restoring moose habitat. So for example, removal of roads, restoration of roads, and using conservation and protection. So if you know an area is good quality moose habitat, it produces a lot of moose, you could set it aside in a protected area. So how do we manage for both moose and caribou considering that they're both in conflict with one another? Well, here's an example of a recent project that I did in the Kootenay region. This project was designed to protect important moose habitat features and increase or enhance the amount of moose forage post-timber harvest. What we did was that we applied these management levers or management actions only within areas where moose and caribou populations didn't overlap. So you see here I've removed caribou populations buffered by 11.5 kilometers, and what's left is where caribou don't occur. Why did I buffer caribou populations by 11.4 kilometers? Well, that's the daily distance that wolves move in a day. What do you do if moose and caribou overlap 100% and you can't exclude one from the other? Well, you could maybe choose a management action that benefits both species. So for example, habitat restoration and protection, access management, predator control. And if those things aren't enough and those populations are declining, which species should be prioritized? These are difficult decisions that biologists and policymakers face on a regular basis. And they may be obvious decisions or less obvious decisions. But at the end of the day, what are some metrics that you use to figure out which species to prioritize? And there's no clear answer to that, I believe.